And okay. Hello and welcome back to the A-KID-EMIA podcast. I'm your host, Charlotte Duffy, and this is episode number 16, generously funded by the American Philosophical Association. So today we're joined by my friend, Natalie Hannan. She's an assistant professor of philosophy at Providence College in Rhode Island. But before that, she had two postdocs with very long commutes. And so this is really an episode for people with two-body problems, early career researchers, individuals who may already be on a long commute and want to know how to make that possible. Natalie is your person. She did one of these commutes with a toddler in tow. So she really is an expert on all things travel, children, and academia. And so she shares with us her experience, sort of the hacks and tricks that made it possible, what she would have done differently, and how sustainable it is over the long term. So without further ado. I've really been wanting to speak to somebody who has done a kind of ridiculous commute because
Yeah.
not just because these are live questions for me, but because I think I'm not alone in that. I think there are lots of early career researchers who are pinging between different places. You know, they get a 1 year thing here and then they got to drag their whole family somewhere else. And so I have talked to some scholars about this. I had an episode with Gonzalo Dona, who has four kids, and he'd moved like intercontinentally with all of them several times. Jonathan Rutledge, I spoke to as well, did something similar. So it's like people are doing crazy things. So if that could be avoided, through a commute that is painful, but maybe not as painful as a big move, then that would be great. But I think it's hard to find people who have actually chanced that. And then, there's this whole other class of scholars who actually do have permanent positions, but they have this two-body problem, right? So one of them works somewhere, one of them works somewhere else. And it's like, how do you swing that? So, anyways, that's all just to say, I think I'm not alone in wanting to speak to someone like
Nope,
you.
it's very much a live question. I feel like academia is one of the few areas where you could kind of end up anywhere. I feel like there's so many jobs that are like, oh, you're probably in these three major cities. And it's like, no, you really could be anywhere in the US or the world. And so, yeah, I feel like it's a unique problem, especially as, we've had kind of more women who are working in academia and therefore more two-career households. And so trying to figure out, as you were saying, that two-body problem.
Right. And everyone always says it takes a village to raise a child. And so, well, if my village changes every year and I'm not near anyone I ever grew up with or ever knew, that makes the family side really difficult as well. So, I have basically five questions for you.
Yeah,
So I'll just sort of bang them out as we go. But the first one
sure.
is, tell us about your commute. I've heard you say the story before, but I kind of forget. And so, like, what were you doing?
Yeah, so currently I am nice and settled and happy at Providence College. It's funny, I'm actually expecting my third kid right now. And so like thinking back on this is like the first pregnancy that I haven't had to switch OBs halfway through or move states or do any of those crazy things. I'm like, wow, this is so easy. Is this what it's like for most people? But so before I got my job at Providence, I had two postdocs. Those were the ones where I had kind of major commutes. So throughout this time, my husband was working in kind of Fairfield County, Connecticut, so close to New York City, in a normal corporate job that expected him to be there. I mean, with COVID, it was a little bit more flexible when this kind of started, but basically expected him to be there in person most days. And so my first commute was at the University of Rochester. This was about a 6 hour drive or a 1 hour flight from New York City area. So that was a mega commute. That was when I was pregnant with my first kid. So I never had to deal with the child outside the womb being transported at that time. It was mostly me or my husband doing that sort of commute. And I guess as I was getting more and more, heavily pregnant throughout, but I didn't have to deal with the issue of actually carting the kid around separately for that one. And so that was my first postdoc in the philosophy department there. My second postdoc was a year at Duke in the ethics center there. And so, again, husband's still in Connecticut. Now I'm down in North Carolina. For that one, in the fall, I was not teaching, but was doing various kind of other programming things. So I didn't have to be there every week, but I was there a lot of weeks for a couple days to sort of do some of this programming. In the spring, I was teaching. And so I was largely down there when I needed to teach while my husband was still up in Connecticut. So that one might be more of interest for the listeners we're thinking of. So that point, my first kid had been born. Towards the end of that, I got pregnant with my second kid, but that one was the one where I had to really think about, having children and also being, doing this kind of up and down the East Coast thing.
Sure. So what did you do with the first child? Wait, what did you do with both children?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the second child was safely in the womb at least until I got my job at Providence. So that one was easy.
Okay, good.
So for our older guy, in the fall it was fairly ad hoc. There were some days when, I would be able to have a family member come up if I was just there for a couple days, and so I would commute down by myself. That had its own challenges. I highly recommend a breast milk thermos if you're in that situation and pumping, needing to transport breast milk. But I would also bring him sometimes. And so that again, it was very ad hoc in the fall. I would, I took advantage of in Durham, they had the sort of, like Durham Sitters Facebook group that my guess is a staple of a lot of these kind of mid-sized cities where I would find, I found one or two sitters who would be able to kind of watch my son for the times that we needed. He was probably about 6 to 9 months at that time in the fall semester. So really kind of I would fly down, usually rent an Airbnb for a couple days, so pretty short term, and then have a sitter kind of come there for the hours that I needed. In the spring, because I was there more full time, we had kind of a longer term, short term rental, well, long term, short term rental, 4 months or so of a short term rental. So at least we're kind of coming back to the same place. I had driven one of my cars down there. And we had kind of a part-time nanny, whom we actually found through one of those books or those groups, but she was kind of a more consistent presence. She would be there kind of 3 or 4 days each week while I was teaching. And so we'd be doing a lot of kind of flights back and forth, but during that spring, we had kind of a home base. We had, a home nanny who didn't change from week to week. The fall though it was pretty ad hoc. It was kind of what did I need this week and how are we going to figure out this particular week?
Wow. And so, sorry, the nanny was in Connecticut, or was the nanny
He
would
was in
come
Durham.
with
He
you?
was at Duke. Yeah. So we had kind of an occasional sitter in Connecticut, but usually the childcare would be sort of when I was in Durham and needed that. We definitely should have had more childcare when I was in Connecticut. Looking back, I we definitely were scraping by a little bit, especially for that semester. But yeah, once I was kind of more full time in Durham, we had kind of consistent childcare there. And then when I was back in Connecticut, more of sort of an as needed basis for, more like college age sitters who could come in and help.
Wow. Wow. That's a lot. And then so my first postdoc, the first year of it was, yeah, kind of hybrid. And so I just sort of spammed like listserv that I had just learned about with people who were like-minded,
Yeah.
part of this group I was part of. And so that's like how we found one of the people. And then a neighbor I just happened to bump into had a son the same age. And I was like, hey, you want to
Can we work
it's
something out
kind
here?
of all you, but it can be at my house if you want.
Yep.
And that sort of work. But yeah, it was like very ad hoc. And so, but that went well for you though, it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah, it did. I mean, I would say if I could have done it again, I think I would have made especially the fall a little less ad hoc, which I think didn't really have much to do with the commute and more to do with how much childcare I thought I didn't need and ended up actually needing more of a kind of transition to motherhood and having kids thing. But yeah, it did work, especially once we were kind of down and more settled in Durham, at least temporarily. Yeah, I think taking advantage of things like the kind of, either the network. I mean, my postdoc had a lot of people who had helpful advice and info. I think one of them connected me to this group of, kind of local sitters. And so taking advantage of that, and then taking advantage of, yeah, things like if you're only there for a couple days, no need to be renting an apartment for the whole semester. It's probably going to be cheaper to kind of come as needed. So if you're not actually teaching, full time during that semester, are there other ways to make that work that are a little bit more sustainable?
So it sounds like you kind of need a second home, like a second base, a landing pad.
It is nice to have a second base. Second base, yeah. And before we had the kind of short term or longer term short term rental in the spring, I remember now what we did is we drove a car down. I think, each of us had a car at this point. So we drove one of those cars down and just kept it at the airport with like various stuff that we needed, and like, long-term economy parking or something like that. And so, obviously some stuff I could keep at my office, but a lot of the kids stuff or whatever, if we're kind of moving from place to place or don't have like a rental apartment or something, that was actually a really good resource to be like, okay, well, it's like in my car down there. I also have a car down there. Again, it's a situation where, you would probably need each person to have a car, but having my car down there was actually a nice kind of quasi home base,
No, I
that I think
think
I wouldn't have thought about in advance.
that's such a great point because there's so much gear, right? There's so so many tools. Like the most recent time I flew with my kids, I had three of them, so it's like three car seats. So you need like one of those travel things just for the car seats, and
Yeah.
it's just like a nightmare.
I'm very good at traveling with car seats now. I like strap one to the suitcase. I got one in a backpack. I'm like, I've never done three, but two, I feel like that's my limit. I can do two by myself.
No, some people are savvy, and there's like flight specific gear that you can buy
Right.
here. We had the huge grow car seats, so the like just
Yep.
enormous worst thing to travel with ever kind of thing.
Yep.
Okay, so it sounds like yeah, having a second landing pad is probably not a bad idea. Sounds kind of resource intensive financially, so
Yeah,
um,
yeah. That's why I think, having something like a car down there, maybe if you don't have I mean, you will need somewhere to sleep if you're staying down there multiple nights. But if it's more like an Airbnb situation, having something like a car, having your own office or something like that is going to be helpful. But yeah, I think it is absolutely right that one thing I was very lucky about is that we had the resources to have, a sort of second place when I was there that semester. And obviously that's not something that's available for everybody.
sure, yeah. And I want to ask you just very briefly about your spring semester. So when you're teaching a lot, did you have the liberty to request to stack that teaching in one semester or another? Because it seems like the extent to which you do have that liberty could actually determine whether this is possible for a lot of people.
Yeah, so my postdoc, actually both postdocs were very flexible with this. I know when I was kind of pregnant, before I told them I was pregnant at Rochester, they sort of asked, do you want more of your courses in the spring? And I was like, actually, I probably want more of them in the fall, if that's sort of all the same to you, knowing that, I'd be kind of taking maternity leave in the spring. Same deal at Duke. I said, look, I just had this baby, I'm not sure I'm really ready to teach in the fall yet. That's going to be really difficult, especially with, a 5-month-old. And they were very flexible about that. And so, yeah, I think both times, I think if you're teaching, a 3-3 or a 4-4 load, that's going to be more difficult to ask for. I bet probably teaching 8 classes a semester is going to be tough. But if it's a postdoc situation where they're expecting more like a 2-1 or a 2-2 or something like that, then I think usually they probably are just going to want the courses taught within a year. Again, universities differ, but I got the sense that yeah, given that all the courses I was teaching were different from each other, that they didn't really care were they fall courses, were they spring courses. And so I think mostly they would find it funny that somebody would want something like a 0-3, but I have friends in the profession who do a 4-0 because they have, similar two body needs and then are just somewhere else for the spring semester. And I think that is true across a lot of different universities.
So you're speaking now of colleagues at Providence that you have?
No, I'm
Or
thinking
just
about colleagues I have. I'm thinking about somebody I know, I think in the University of South Florida who has a similar situation, who, it's normally a 2-2 load, but they've allowed him to have like a 4-0 load so that he could be elsewhere in the spring.
Oh, wow. And they don't require him to be physically present really at all?
I don't know the details, but I think largely not. Or maybe again, it's sort of like my fall semester at Duke, there are a couple programming things or whatever that you should pop in for, but nobody's really checking up on you week to week. I find that this is largely true in academia, with some exceptions. Like, as if you were getting your classes taught and you were doing your duties, when you're not teaching, people usually aren't like, well, were you in your office or were you not? It's very different from a corporate job that way, where it's not like, oh, well, if you're not in your office, then you must not be working. At least this has been my experience. People aren't usually checking up on you in the same way if you are teaching your classes, getting your stuff done. But obviously, universities differ. There might be places that are a little bit more like that.
Yeah. And you would say that's true even at like a small liberal arts college, it tends to be more intimate. That's still been your experience.
It's certainly been my experience. Yeah. I mean, there are certainly times where I'm like, wow, I don't know if I've ever really seen this person during this year. Now, obviously, maybe you have different teaching schedules or something like that. But especially, I mean, my department is really large. It's 25, maybe 26 people. And so I'm certainly not keeping track of, well, whom did I see this week or something like that. I think, yeah, I think in general, unless again, there's some duty that you're shirking that you were supposed to be there for and you clearly weren't. I think there is, less of a sense of, well, I'm checking up on this person every week and making sure they're physically in their office.
Yeah, I think that's been my read as well, especially post-COVID, because so many of these events, like the colloquia or something, also have a kind of hybrid option. Um,
Precisely. We still do department meetings on Zoom. I know, plenty of places have returned to in person, but, it's not like we're even expected to be in our office for that.
yeah, I'm not sure how true this is of like interdisciplinary places. So centers and
Mhm.
things like this seem to
Yeah,
really, they're more mission driven from what I can tell and really want that community.
right.
It might vary based on the department. I'm sure
No, for sure.
sciences are probably all in person in the lab, but okay, that's great. So how is your productivity in all of this research wise? Were you able to keep, keep it going, or was that just really difficult, like especially when you were traveling more intensively?
Yeah, so I would say certainly the kind of fall semester after I had my first baby was not particularly productive, but I think that had very little to do with the commute and probably a lot more to do with just having had a baby and trying to find, what life was looking like after that. I would say in the spring and certainly in my year of kind of long commuting while I was pregnant before I had my first kid, I didn't see it being a really big issue. I think the issue is really more just, well, how much childcare time do you have on the ground? And obviously, that's going to look different. If you're spending some time commuting, maybe that's different from week to week. But I don't think the commute per se was like a really major factor there. One thing I'll say too is it's maybe going to depend on what kind of commuting you're doing. So if you're driving for, 6 hours, that's going to be largely dead time. Sure, maybe you can do some calls or listen to some books or something like that, but I think it's very different if you have a 3 hour train ride, if you have a 3 hour flight, something like that. Most of that time you probably can use productively. Maybe it's not going to be when you do your deepest research, but it's probably when you can do grading. It's probably when you can, do the emails you need to answer. It's probably when you can do a lot of that stuff. And so I think in some ways when I was traveling with my baby, less so, but if I was traveling by myself back and forth from Duke, on the plane, that was actually reasonably productive time. Compared to just being in a car for the same length of time. Obviously, flying is a little bit more expensive. The one thing I would also say is a lot of the mid-sized cities where these universities are located tend to have mid-sized airports. So when I was commuting from Connecticut to Durham, there's actually, you might know about this since you were in Connecticut too, the New Haven Airport has, this sort of budget airline of Velo Airlines that flies directly to Raleigh-Durham. And it's this, no frills budget airline. It takes like an hour, wheels up to wheels down. And getting to the New Haven Airport and through security is super easy. And so it's not like I have to go to LaGuardia and like deal with all of that. And I think that's true. It's true about Providence. I think it's true a lot of these kind of mid-sized cities. The commuting experience by plane is not as bad as it might be in a major city. It's going to be really straightforward. But yeah, I think the plane travel itself is really not that bad and can be used really productively.
So how did you work with your toddler there? You just
When I was traveling with him, not very well, unless he was sleeping, and babies do a lot of sleeping. Again, I think that's more of a function of, you sort of consider that dead time just in the same way that when I'm in the afternoons with my kids, that's basically dead time. And then it's really a function of how much childcare are you having apart from that. In my case, when we were down at Duke more full time, it was more like 24 to 32 hours depending on the week, and that was sufficient for me to sort of do teaching and do at least, some of the research that I needed to do. And I was also in the job market at that time, so, a lot of that was kind of taken up by that. But that I never felt like oh my gosh, I'm just completely drowning in the way that I kind of did in the fall after my baby was born, which again is largely a function of just having more like 6 to 8 hours of childcare a week, which I do not recommend for anybody if you're trying to get a bunch of research done or be on the job market or something like that.
Yeah, I feel like I've pretty thoroughly vetted how far you can go with having no childcare whatsoever. And it maybe can be done, but you lose your sanity a little.
Yeah, I think that's about right, or a lot of sleep, which you probably desperately need.
Yes.
Yeah, I know you said you have somebody coming in kind of 3 days a week now.
I do
Um,
have someone 3 days a week. Yeah. So I've tried to avoid this whole issue by securing some grant money that gives me a little bit more leverage in my current
yeah,
stock to say I'm going to come in on my terms. And that's
yeah,
been actually really a great solution because I don't need to come in really at all.
yeah,
So I just, keep everything in-house, keep the kids in-house because leaving
yeah.
is very hard. I mean, we go out once a week for something, but I've got 5 kids now, so it's like a Herculean task. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so that works really well. And then nap time, having a really rigid nap time. So I know I
Yes.
can get, at least an hour and a half, 2 hours solid work in there is valuable.
Yeah. Definitely take advantage of the naps.
Yeah, definitely. And just like a rigid sleep schedule is worth the upfront effort, I think,
Yes.
for the long-term payoff
Absolutely.
of knowing you can have an evening, knowing you can have a nap period. But okay, so great. So it was productive. What was the tempo of this experience? Like, how did it actually feel? Were you kind of exasperated the whole time? Because on the commutes I've done of like an hour and a half long drive, it gets to be kind of exasperating. I think partly because, as you had said earlier, the type of commute really matters and driving is just kind of dead time. But nevertheless, it does feel like a lot. And when I talk to other scholars, like I talked to Christopher Tolson, for example, and he was like, I had to live basically right beside my campus, and then I was able to be really productive. So for someone who has to swallow this commute, should they expect to be, living on the edge?
Crazy. It's funny. I think like right now, from my, privilege of living in the same state as my job, which is a very small state, and so not a long commute, I sort of look back at the stuff I did. Like I would wake up at, 4:15 and haul my kid out to drive to New Haven to get on this 6:30 flight to go down to drive to some Airbnb and meet some sitter that, I met on a Facebook group so that I can be there for 2 days and drive back. It sounds crazy. And it just sounds like I couldn't imagine myself doing that. But I do think that when I was doing it and kind of in that mindset, I was just like, well, this is what it's going to take. This is what it takes to survive this two-body problem and both, me and my husband to have the careers that we want to have while also having the family we want to have. And so this is just what it's going to be. I know you're going to ask me about sort of sustainability of commute too. And I think one thing that is sort of helpful here, which, in some ways is frustrating because it kind of prevents you from building that community and putting down the roots and the, kind of in a long-term job, but thinking about it not as kind of this is what it's going to look like for the rest of my life, especially if it's this postdoc or this, visiting assistant professor position or something that's kind of more temporary, but thinking it as really a matter of weeks instead of like, some indefinite amount of time. I mean, a semester is what usually between 12 to 15 weeks. Usually you have two of them. Obviously there's quarter systems or whatever, but usually you've got two sort of 12 to 15 week periods. And then you usually have this really large spate of dead time. Well, not dead time, but time where you probably don't need to be physically there during the summer. And so when you're looking at the fall and you're like, okay, I have this commute, really you have a certain number of weeks where you have to do this thing. Then you're going to get a little bit of a break. Then you're going to have a certain other number of weeks where you're going to do this thing. And then you're going to get a really long break. At least that's going to be how, most sort of academic year temporary positions are set up. And so I think that was really helpful to me to think about it in terms of, okay, here's X number of things I have to do in this chunk of time. That's not that bad. It's not like this sort of, rest of my life, every single week, this is my commute, but really thinking about it semester by semester. Each semester is probably going to be a little different if you have a different teaching schedule or a different situation. And then you're going to have this sort of long space of breathing room. And so it's not just this sort of constant, this is just what my week to week is going to look like getting on a plane or whatever. And so, yeah, I do think when you're kind of in the middle of it, it's just what you do and you know that it's temporary, at least in a sort of year sense, not in terms of like, again, maybe you will do this for several years, but within that semester, within that academic year, you are probably going to get a good bit of breathing room.
That's very valuable. It reminds me of the proverb, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. So just take it, second
Actually.
by second. Um, so, okay, so that's valuable. Let me ask you directly, do you think this could have been sustainable, at least in your specific case, long term, if this wasn't just a 1 year postdoc, but this is what you are expecting to do going forward?
Yeah, so I think my answer is yes and no. So it's funny. So I live in, Providence now, or, a little bit south of Providence, but very close to my job now. And this is where our kids are based or whatever. My husband is actually the one who's doing a reasonable commute now. His job is now based in Manhattan. And so he's going in 3 weeks a month, 3 days a week. So it's not every single day, but it's most weeks. So he'll go in on a Tuesday, come back on a Thursday, or go in on a Wednesday, or go in on a Monday, come back on a Wednesday, and then 1 week a month he's working from home. I think a lot of people would look at that and say that sounds horrible. It's actually been completely sustainable. Neither of us in our family has found this to be a really big problem. There's a couple days a week he's gone, which is true of many people in many situations who have jobs that require a lot of business travel anyway. And then there's a full week he's home and 2 days a week that he's home. So now he's the one who's doing that sort of commute. And so I think, a commute of several hours is totally sustainable. I think the thing that is not sustainable is carting your baby around, because eventually that baby is not going to be a baby anymore. And I do think babies are super, super, super transportable. That's one thing that's really great about them is they're not in school. You can have different people watching them and it's probably fine. They don't have, I don't know, violin lessons or soccer practice or anything like that you have to worry about. If you're a breastfeeding mom, their food is right there. You don't even have to bring it. They sleep a lot. They're very adaptable. And, I have all sorts of like gear and stuff that make it, very easy to transition from one place to another, like a big blackout tent you can like put over your baby's pack and play. Um, that is totally fine. And so I think if you're worried about commuting with a baby, not a problem at all. But again, babies grow, and I think it's very hard. It would be very hard to do the sort of thing that I did for that year at Duke with a 5-year-old, say, because of the sort of, carting him back and forth. You can do it. You can put him on a plane, then also have to pay for a ticket for him because he's also not a lap infant. But he's got to go to school. He's got to, have that sort of schedule and routine. And so I think the commute would have been sustainable, but I think my husband would have been the one doing most of the commuting. I think we could have lived in North Carolina and he could have gone back and forth, and that wouldn't have been that different. It would have been a little bit more annoying than what we do right now. But I think if you are the primary caregiver to your children, which largely I am in my household, then it's likely that you probably should be where your kids are, and those kids should not be moving around once they get older. Not in some like moral should sense, but it's going to be really difficult. And so I think the commute is absolutely doable. And I think, one thing that one would need to think about as you're talking with your spouse or your partner. I assume if you're a single parent, you probably are not having this commuting issue in the same way in most cases, about what exactly kind of the situation is going to be. If you aren't the primary caregiver parent, then I think that commute is going to be, something that you could handle. It'll be annoying, but it will be doable. If you're sort of splitting a lot of the childcare burden more equally, then I think you can also talk about what is that going to look like. Maybe you're a two academic household and you switch off semesters or something. There's all sorts of ways you can kind of make it work. I think the thing that is not sustainable is moving kids back and forth over the course of the year. I think that just is really, really hard to imagine.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Well, um, that settles so many questions that I had personally, and I think probably a lot of people
yeah, yeah.
else.
Hopefully in good ways. I don't
No,
know.
no, in really good ways. Like, it sounds like you came right up against the ceiling of what's doable here. And I like and appreciate that you said a lot about what your experience has been like as a primary caregiver, as a woman, who's nursing, who's pregnant, this and that, because there's a whole set of other questions that you have to ask there. And so, yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah. I mean, I think
super.
that's something that's not talked about enough is, I think we talk about kind of parenting in academia, but I think kind of what your particular spousal situation or not looks like is just, it's going to make a really big difference. I wish that was something I kind of had sat with a little bit more before I had kids, is that like, you know, parents have very different situations. Maybe, your spouse is a stay-at-home parent. That's very different from an academic parent. That's very different from a, normal corporate job parent or a parent who works nights or something like that. Like those things are just going to lead to a whole different host of what's possible and what's not. And so I think we need to be having that conversation more and not just saying, well, parenting in academia, that's, I remember I went to the summit and there was like a man speaking there about work-life balance. And he was like, oh, well, my work-life balance is that my wife stays home and watches our kids. I was like, well, that's great for you, but that gives me nothing helpful to go on about how I achieve work-life balance in my own two-career home. So yeah, I'm glad that you're having these conversations with all sorts of, different people in different situations. I think that's one of the only ways that we can really figure out what is possible and what is sustainable.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate, you taking the time to talk to me because it's women like you who are really, as I said, scraping against the ceiling. I try to find you guys, that one of my last kids, Lori, was like had like 11 or 9 kids or something, and she homeschooled all of them and was like basically an instructor. And I was like, how are you doing this? And so there are these women who are just real ninjas. And so, yeah, it's just so great and valuable to hear your experience and talk about what it's like as a woman. Is there anything you would add that we haven't already covered about your experience, particularly as a woman, as a mom, that is relevant to this question of commute beyond just, as I say, the things that you've already.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about the sort of spousal situation is a really big one. I think that is sort of the biggest thing that I feel like, was kind of missed when I was thinking about this. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I had very easy pregnancies. I didn't have to worry about how that was, affecting my productivity or my commute or something like that. Obviously, I know that's not true for every woman, and that's also something that's hard to know in advance. And so that could be a whole other side of, what this is like. But I do think, yeah, thinking about kind of, and I think it's something that maybe we shy away from talking about of like, being a primary caregiver to your child because it sounds like, oh, well, that means I'm not as committed to academia or I, don't really want my job and I really just want to be a stay-at-home parent or something like that. And maybe that is the case for some women, but it certainly wasn't the case and isn't the case for me. But I think I still very much identify, as the primary caregiver in my household. And so I think that opens up just a really different set of questions and considerations from thinking about, are you in a situation in which, maybe kind of your child care time is more equal, or maybe, the spouse or the partner is the primary caregiver parent. And so what it's like for you as a woman in academia is going to be very different, or at least somewhat different. And so I think that's a conversation we should be having more of. And in that conversation, sort of destigmatizing thinking of ourselves as primary caregivers and also, academics, because I think that's just not going to be helpful. It's just going to sort of paint women as like, well, if you want the academic job, then you better be, having a spouse who stays home or something like that so that you can kind of devote everything to your career. That's just not the reality for a lot of women. And so we should be thinking about, well, are there various accommodations or various considerations that we should be making for women or for any parent who considers themselves a primary caregiver?
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you so much.
Uh,
I think these are topics that definitely need to be discussed, and I think because they are not, a lot of people probably are sacrificing, I would guess, their personal goals, rather than their professional ones.
mhm.
And that's just so tragic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm really, really happy that you invited me on here, and thank you so much for, excuse me, for continuing to have these conversations with parents. I think it is so valuable, and it's such a great resource for, it would have been a great resource for me, 5 years ago when I was starting to think about these questions as, I was starting to have kids. So I'm really glad that there's a space for this now.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much.